Hello, and welcome to Sonatas She Wrote. This week, I am returning to Haydn's La Reine Symphony to explain the Type 4 sonata form. This symphony, generally numbered 85, is part of a set of 6 that today we call the Paris Symphonies. In Paris, Haydn had a good reputation, and Claude François-Marie Rigollet, whose name I am not at all sure I'm pronouncing correctly, the Count of Ogny, commissioned this set from Haydn for the Concert de la Loge Olympique. I'm a little more confident about that one. Which was an orchestra of a huge size in Paris, containing numbers closer to a modern orchestra than Haydn's own at Esterhazy, which rarely exceeded 20 players and was most often 15 or so. Paris, and indeed the French nobility, received the symphonies raucously. As Charles Rosen points out in his book Sonata Forms, the Parisian musical public would have been well acquainted with Haydn's style. His symphonies had been popular there since the 60s. Similarly today, if you went to a concert of Nico Muhly's music, you wouldn't expect it to sound like Joan Tower. They likewise would not expect Haydn to sound like Joseph Bologna, who incidentally also conducted the premiere of these symphonies. In his book Sonata Forms, Rosen makes note of a particular reviewer who writes, "This vast genius, who in each of his pieces knows how to draw developments so rich and varied from a unique theme," he would have used the word sujet, meaning subject, "is very different from those sterile composers who pass continually from one idea to another, for lack of knowing how to present one idea in varied forms." Of course, this monothematicism is one of the hallmarks of Haydn's style, and as Rosen points out, it's not quite accurate. In my experience, and apparently also Rosen's, Haydn's S-themes, though certainly based on the primary theme, are not at all carbon copies. They tend to be varied from the primary theme, which is really what this reviewer is praising, a high level of organicism and unity in Haydn's music. So why don't we dive in? As you know from the title, this is going to be a Type 4 sonata, which is the sonata rondo strategy. As I think I've said before, the sonata types get increasingly complex as the number increases. So let's get a little theoretical. Hepokoski and Darcy, in their chapter on Type 4 sonatas, have this to say about Haydn's finales. Haydn's Type 4 movements are to be identified as such primarily by their binary or rounded binary themes. Here, we have the latter. There's a brief return to the A section, completing a PAC in B-flat major. Although relatively short, this exposition is packed full of surprises. Our first issue after the transition is locating the medial caesura. But in this symphony, we seem to either not have one, or maybe we have this blocked one here. Sometimes there is no actual caesura in these moments, but rather a very large texture change, which this does have. But typically, Haydn is much clearer, and a texture change as caesura would be deformative into the 19th century, let alone here in the 1780s. So what are we to make of the material which follows? It's not new. It's based on the primary theme, but it's modulatory and sequential. I'm inclined to call it Fortspannung, which would make this a continuous exposition. I have a video fully explaining this concept using a flute sonata by C.P.E. Bach if you're interested, but essentially a continuous exposition is one which, rather than a medial caesura and secondary theme, has a transition which merges into Fortspannung, a kind of developmental sounding spinning out of an original idea. The effect of a continuous exposition on a listener relies on that expectation of a caesura which the composer then subverts. A continuous exposition is possible in a sonata rondo, and as we'll see when we get to the recapitulation, in some ways Haydn seems to be using this type 4 strategy to solve the problem of this continuous exposition. Now, this is the moment that's truly unusual about this movement. In my opinion, this is a failed exposition because we do not have a perfect cadence in the dominant, but rather an IAC. Note the circled high C in the oboe. I say in my opinion because I'm fairly certain that Hepokoski would disagree with me. Because that high C is really starting the closing theme, I think he would probably consider it to be separate from the cadence. My general impression from reading sonata theory is that Hepokoski and Darcy are unwilling to label something as expositional or sonata failure except in the most dire and obvious of circumstances. Perhaps they have a reason for this? If they have one, I haven't been able to find it. Specifically in this case, the recapitulation of this movement will actually explain some of my labeling in the exposition, so I'll defend my positions once we get to those sections. As you can see in this chart, from page 268 of a Sonata Theory Handbook, one of the essential parts of a Type 4 sonata, and indeed probably the biggest hint that you are dealing with one, is the sudden return to the tonic to open this space. Really occurring before the development, at least a partial repetition of the primary theme refrain is necessary to say that a piece is engaging with the Type 4 strategy. Haydn repeats the primary theme on the tonic and then moves into a non-tonic episode around bars 86 to 91. Certainly by bar 91, he's moved away from the tonic and will now begin quickly cycling through different tonal areas. E flat major to F minor, D minor, G minor, and then back to F minor. The preoccupation with the minor dominant is the most worrying in terms of our narrative. To reference a minor dominant is to hint at the parallel minor and the implied potential for tragic collapse into a minor key, which we already experienced somewhat in the failed exposition. First movement of the symphony, the analysis for which you can find on my channel, Haydn ends the development with a dominant lock, which is in the completely wrong place. This is setting up a return to G minor, not B flat major. The music seems to realize this, and the effect is that it is frozen in place, thinking where to go next. Also, as in the first movement, we slip out of this section with a chromatic break down into B flat, which then finally transforms into a dominant lock in B flat major, setting up the return to the primary refrain. In the same section of Sonata Theory, Hepokoski and Darcy touch on the recap of this movement, saying, Haydn revisited a sufficient number of thematic modules within the tonal resolution portion to provide a general sense of their quasi-symmetrical return. In other instances, Haydn merely touched lightly on an individual referential module or two with a much compressed tonal resolution, as in the finale of Symphony No. 85. Here, the recapitulation is quite compressed, so I'll just play through its entirety, but pay close attention to the potential medial caesura and Haydn's proposed ESC. I'm sure now you can see why I labeled the exposition continuous as I did. It was because this recap is so clearly not continuous. Rather than a blocked medial caesura, we actually have an open space which clears the room for the secondary theme. Unlike in the introduction, this theme is not Fortspannung, but quickly makes its way to the cadence, and where the oboe prevented us from cadencing before, it now politely waits a bar to enter, allowing for a perfect, authentic cadence. I believe this is Haydn's reason for compressing the thematic modules of this recapitulation. Really, what he's done is fixed the continuous exposition problem that we had in the beginning of this movement and straightened everything out into a more typical two-part recapitulation. The closing zone which follows is certainly based on the primary theme, but it isn't opening a new module, making this a sonata rondo with 3 rotations rather than the more usual 4. Although we had some very archetypically Haydn-esque twists and turns, I thought this movement was a short and relatively simple explanation of the Type 4 sonata, which can get quite complicated. You most often find the form in a final movement, especially as the finale to a concerto, where it's almost the first level default. If you enjoyed this video, please consider joining my Patreon and pledging any amount you can. And if you're unable to, but would like to help in another way, like and subscribe, and consider telling one of your more theoretical friends about the channel.